All right, this is our last Unit 5 lesson. It is Lesson 7, Part 2. And like I said in Part 1, it's better to separate out this composition stuff because it is a little bit tricky. So this will be a relatively short video, but we want to focus just on this one operation so you guys can really get it down. So another method to combine functions, so another operation, we've got kind of a fifth operation for polynomials. It's called composition of functions. So the composite function is defined like this. You guys will see our notation. So in parentheses, you'll see f, that open circle, we read that as f composed with g. And then we have the x in parentheses, which remember, it doesn't mean you're multiplying by x, you're not doing anything with it, it's just reminding us that that's our variable that we're using. And it looks like this. We read this as f of g of x. So this, you guys have seen like f of 2 before. That means you take a 2 and plug it into your function f. When you see f of g of x, that means you take your function g of x and you plug it into your function f. Okay, so it's referred to as the composition. One function gets plugged into another function. So we're actually going to do the whole bottom half of this sheet to make sure we've got everything kind of down pat. So f composed with g. Remember, that is f of g of x. So that means you take your function g and you plug it into your function f, just the same way that you would take like a 2 and plug it into your function f. So we're going to take our function g right here, the x minus 1, and we're going to plug it into our function f. So instead of taking like a 2 and plugging it in for this x, we're going to take this whole expression and plug it in for x. So x cubed becomes x minus 1 cubed and then plus 8. So this used to just be an x, but I replaced it, and instead of replacing it just with a number, I replaced it with this whole expression that I have right here. I replaced it with my function g, which is what this notation is telling me to do. So the plugging in and like figuring out what to plug in where is usually the tricky part, and then from that point on, it's just algebra. So cubing something, remember, means you have to write it out 3 times. So we're gonna write x minus 1, x minus 1, x minus 1, and we're gonna do like a triple FOIL and then add 8. So first, multiply just the 2 of them together. So x minus 1, x times x would be an x squared. And then on the outside, we have a negative 1x. On the inside, we have a negative 1x. So combine those to a negative 2x. And last, negative 1 times negative 1. And then we have this third copy to multiply in. So things might get a little crowded here. So foiling this out, remember, you're like taking this and distributing to the x minus 1. And then you move here, and then you move here. So take the x squared and distribute to the x minus 1. That gives us x cubed minus x squared. Then move to the negative 2x and distribute that. So that would be negative 2x squared plus 2x. Then move to the 1 and distribute that. So that would be a positive x minus 1. And finally, after all that, you have this plus 8. So I'm going to move up to the top here. X cubed is my only cube. For my squareds, I have negative 1, negative 2, so a negative 3x squared. For my x's, I have 2x and 1x, so that's a 3x. And finally, I have a negative 1 and a positive 8, so that would be plus 7. So that is my final answer. It's what I get when I plug one expression into the other. So now let's look at number 12. H composed with g of x. So that little open circle, sometimes people see that as like an O, so you could read it as of, like h of g of x. So that means that you are taking your function g and you are plugging it into our function h. So we are taking our function g and plugging it into our function h. So we take 5x minus 3, but you replace that x with this function right here. So this started out as our function h, but in place of the x, we plugged in our function g. So function g is literally getting plugged into function h the same way that you could plug in a number. And then once you figure out what's going where, you just simplify. So with this one, we distribute the 5. We get 5x minus 5, and then subtract 3. So this one is much simpler. We just need to combine our numbers at the end, and that is h composed with g. Next example here is f composed with h. So f of h means we are taking our function h and plugging it into our function f. So here's our function f. We're going to take our function h and plug it in right there. So very similar to this, except instead of g right here, we're going to put h right there. So x cubed becomes 5x minus 3 cubed, and then plus 8. So we're going to do another triple FOIL, just like we did with number 11. This one's going to get a touch more complicated. It's bigger numbers. Try to write small. All right, I'm going to write kind of little so I can squeeze everything in. So start with these two. 5x times 5x is 25x squared. Outside, this is a negative 15x, and so is the inside. So negative 15 would be negative 30x. And the last, negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. We're going to FOIL it out one more time with this last piece, and then add 8. So distribute one piece at a time. So if I take 25x squared and distribute that here, 25x squared times 5x would be 125x cubed. I'm trying to leave space for one more line under here. And then times negative 3 would be negative 75x squared. Then move to this one. Negative 30x times 5x would be negative 150x squared. And then negative 30x times negative 3 would be a positive 90x. And finally move to the 9. 9 times 5x would be 45x. And 9 times negative 3 would be a negative 27. And after all that, we had 8. All right, so I'm going to write my last line underneath. For the cubes, I only have 125x cubed, just that first term. And then for the squareds, I have negative 75, negative 150. So that is negative 225x squared. For the x's, whoops, I said x here and then I didn't write it. That would have messed us up. 90x and 45x, that is 135x. And negative 27 and positive 8 combined to a negative 19. So this beautiful expression here is what I get when I plug h into my function f. All right, and one last one here. G of f, or g composed with f, means I'm taking my function f and plugging it into my function g. So here's my function g. When you see that x right there, you're just going to plug in this function. So x minus 1 becomes x cubed plus 8 minus 1. And there's even less to do with this one than there was up here. So all I have to do is just combine the 8 and the negative 1, and that is it. So as you can see, some of them are much simpler than others. Some of them are quite complex, but either way, you're just figuring out the order. That's the most important part. All right, and then our bottom ones, these now have numbers. So g of h of 2 means that we are taking g, plugging in h, plugging in 2. And so you kind of work from the inside out. So the 2 gets plugged into your function h. That's our first move. That's going to give us an answer. Then when we have that answer, that gets plugged into g. So the first thing we're doing is taking 2 and plugging it into h. So here's h. I want to plug in a 2. So I do 5 times 2 minus 3. So that is 10 minus 3, which is 7. So we get a 7 for this first move here. Then you're going to take that 7 and plug that into g. Okay, so we're going to take that 7 and plug that into g. So here's g right here. If we plug in a 7, we get 7 minus 1, which is 6. So that would be your answer. So g of h of 2 means the 2 gets plugged into the h. You get an answer there. That answer gets plugged into the g. So one last problem, we'll do the same thing here. This is h of f of negative 6, which means the negative 6 gets plugged into the f. You get an answer. That answer gets plugged into the h. So we kind of move from right to left here, or from inside to outside if you write it this way. So f of negative 6, I can plug a negative 6 up here into f. So I take negative 6 and cube it, and then add 8. So negative 6 times negative 6 times negative 6, that is negative 216. And then I add 8. So that leaves me with negative 208. So that's just the first plug-in. Now I take that negative 208 and I plug that into h. So we're working from the inside out or from right to left. So the negative 208 gets plugged into h. So 5x minus 23, we plug in the negative 208. So 5 times negative 208, that's negative, let's see, negative 1,040. And then we subtract 3. So they're both negative, so this ends up being negative 1,043. And that would be your answer.